So just you're realizing, slowly, so we're already in the panel discussion now. I would like to just continue here. You can ask questions to everybody, also to Mike and Dominic, or feel free to reply.
So thank you very much for these interesting talks. I have a bit more pragmatic question, because what happens if you have a project and you receive money through crowdfunding and then you notice the project can't be realized? What happens with the money?
On our platform, so did everyone hear the question? So what happens to a project if you receive funding and the project can't be realized? On our platform, we encourage researchers to communicate that with their backers. It's not perfect. We are still getting into a system where we can kind of force researchers to do that as a stipulation of funding. But we don't have a good system, right? We don't have a way to return the money. We don't offer that service. I think that for researchers who have had to have a radical change in direction of their project, their backers have understood that, especially when the researcher is really transparent. So anything from, I couldn't do my research at this field site because I couldn't get into the country, to, I can't study this system anymore because it's not accessible to me. The backers have responded really well.
More questions from the audience? You can raise your hand at any time, yeah? Come to you.
In the last presentation, you talked about this Australian research group that made this virus for $100,000, right?
Oh, Mike did, yeah.
No, I think it was in this one. Just, it was about the science is happening with or without us. There was one slide, I think.
Oh,
the pox virus.
Oh, the pox virus.
I didn't really understand what this has to do with all of the other stuff. Just to stress out that they did this research without crowdfunding, or?
Just that science is going to happen whether or not it's supported by institutions or the public. I didn't make that clear, but they did not check this project with their institution before they did the project. So where you would traditionally think that a university has, institutional review and checks and balances to see what research is being done, some researchers will do it no matter what. And these researchers, claim they have specific good intentions, but just because they can do it, or just because they have good intentions, doesn't necessarily mean that someone else also has them. And I think that what science happens is wrapped up in this question of science communication.
There's another question here in the back. Close to, I see a panda here.
What I've noticed is when we are looking for crowdfunding in Europe, that we actually not can depend on a crowd like people we don't know, okay? We need to go to a company that already exists, had a success, and talk to them to get a bigger amount of money out of it. So how do we gonna solve this problem? Because not everybody is trusty enough to invest in somebody he doesn't know. How do we take that step? And that's what she said. We need to, wir müssen Leute überzeugen von unser Projekt, und wir müssen unser geistiges Eigentum auch schützen, in dem Sinne. Wie machen wir das am besten?
Who is the question? For the whole panel? Yeah. Okay. So Mike, Dominic, if you want to reply.
Yeah, there was I'll try to translate the German part. The question is, how do we protect our ideas? That was the question that came on earlier. And how do we go beyond the people that we actually know if we really have expensive projects that we want to tackle and have funded?
Well, those are two really good questions, and to some extent, they're not new. Because, as scientists, we face the same ideas, like at what point do we present at conferences, a project that has already preliminary results that we know would be interesting to the crowd, without, accelerating the possibility that another lab is going to take over and continue. So it's not a new, the thing that we need to realize that all the problems we're facing right now are not new problems. We have new platforms, new ways of potentially moving forward, but the problems themselves are not new. The fact that we need to find funding for science is not new. right? Like in United States, I'm in a public university, we got a lot of cuts from the federal government, so we turn to foundation to try to fund projects that traditionally, right, were funded by the federal government. So it goes back to a communication issue. How can we adapt the way we communicate about our research to whom we want to convince? It's a persuasion exercise. And I would claim that, when social media environments, we need to use persuasion tactics as well to attract crowds. If you want to have private business, persuasion tactics also as far as how you present your research. As far as like protecting your ideas, that's something that always existed. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Exactly. No, I'm more like the general point, I think, of crowdfunding is, Dominique is perfectly right. Many of the problems or challenges that we see in crowdfunding contexts are challenges and problems that we have in other contexts as well. And they're kind of catalyzed by the specific context because it's very quick and it's very visible. But, and my presentation was kind of the summary of the research sounded rather critical towards crowdfunding, and I could show you the panda and everything in the end. But I think overall, even though we have this beautiful festival here and everything, we also shouldn't overestimate crowdfunding. Right. Crowdfunding is an interesting way of having smaller scientific projects funded in a quick and different way, and it makes the whole funding environment that science has more diverse and has a lot of positive potential that we as researchers can really use. But it's really far away from supplanting the traditional grant system. But the traditional grant system, you can agree with the problems of peer review and everything that I've outlined in my presentation. Even the Swiss Science, the National Fund, the SNF in Switzerland, even they can't fund all the projects that they deem generally fundable. They can't. And funding lines in Switzerland are rather high compared to the US. We're talking about 40% in Switzerland compared to 10% in the US. But even here, you can't fund all the projects that are fundable. So having more ways of doing that, for me, as not necessarily a social scientist doing research on that, but as a scientist, as a researcher looking for funding as well, is a good thing. We have to discuss it and we have to reflect upon it. And that, again, also is a social scientific task. That's our job as social scientists then, again, as well. But that's more of a meta point.
And to go back to your point, though, we could also think of crowdfunding as seed funding to be used to collect preliminary data that can be used to actually collect bigger funds later on. I think this is something like creative ideas that a traditional funder wouldn't fund as a starting point could actually benefit from this kind of funds. So I think this is a creative way of thinking about that as well.
Yeah, and in terms of protecting ideas, I think that on Experiment, we encourage researchers to be as open and transparent as possible, but we don't force you to put your proprietary methods on there. And I think that for the vast majority of researchers, if the method is the proprietary or protected part, there are ways to explain what you're doing without talking about your secret methods. If your question itself is the truly innovative part, then maybe crowdfunding isn't for you. But I also would guess that if one person has asked this question, someone else has already asked it. They may not be asking it openly, they might also be secretly funding it.
Maybe it's a good moment for us also to tell you how our idea was born. Of course, we were very much inspired by Experiment.com. But at that time, about 4 years ago, me and Luc, we were working for the Swiss National Science Foundation, has been mentioned. And we did some internal analysis and looked at the data. It turned out that most projects of the Swiss National Science Foundation are funded over 2 to 4 years. And are between 100,000 to 1 million, in average 500,000 plus minus a few hundred. So it's long-term projects, it's heavy money. So if you want 20, 50,000 for a side project, it's not the right way to go. And on top, you are, I'll use the word stuck a bit in your CV. So, right, so for example, Mike, sorry I misuse you now for communication purposes.
Yeah, of course.
He's doing science communication. He suddenly discovers some mushroom growing on his bench, and he wants to look at it and goes to the Science National Foundation. They would say that's not your expertise, right? So how can scientists step out of this? So that's how we actually evolved and then saw this experiment, thought we could do something similar. However, and that's maybe a difference between the two platforms, and I would like to go in this direction because both of you mentioned peer review and quality control. We figured out that, you know, if you take Albert again, you know, Albert published his E=MC2 before peer review. And he was himself a victim of peer review, right? And later his papers were peer reviewed and rejected. And he got very angry, but it turned out that the peer reviewers were right. So quality control in science became something that made science better. And so we were like, can we really be peer reviewers? I mean, he's an expert in chemistry, I'm a biochemist, molecular biologist, but if ecology, no idea. So that's why we switched gears and we said, we open up for everybody. We allow actually Panda Bear Science if you want. We allow people who want to talk about science, like journalists. It doesn't necessarily need to be research. It can also be communication about your field, about the book that you want to write, about the little experiment you want to try, but also a conference about science. Why not? Important is that the public is exposed to science, that we make bridges between society and the audience. And so, closing this story, maybe to you, Mike, Dominic, also quality control. Is this important really for crowdfunding?
I think it is, depending on what your goal is. So like if you say, for example, that you want to help a scientist communicate about their research, and they have a project to do so, I mean, I wish there was a way to constructively give them feedback to do it better. I mean, I feel like there's also the opportunity for crowdfunding to be experiential education for all of us. If I want to do an art installation and go out of science communication and they have potential, it would be great that this kind of sites could also be a place for all of us to grow in a way. So it depends how you define quality, but I think there is, you know, really food for thought there.
Yeah, but exactly, but just to keep on this, I'm coming in a minute. So we need, but what would it be, right? So it's a bit like democracy, right?
Yes,
Often people say we need a better version, but we don't know anything better
Exactly.
yet. So at the moment, peer review is the democracy of science. And so we all have to accept that we can do it better. So would there be a way maybe to develop platforms, maybe even together, where we introduce kind of peer review for crowdfunding through the scientists? But what would we give back to the scientists because they don't want to participate in it?
And just one thing before we talk, since we're talking a lot about peer review, I mean, I'm involved in a lot of experiments about peer review. We're trying to find better ways of peer reviews. There's some platforms where actually you submit your article, it's accepted from the start, the peer review is open, the reviewers correspond with the authors to actually change the publication. It's all in a platform. To at the end of the day, you know, it's a collaboration that ends up between the reviewers and the person. So there's different ways to think of peer review, which is not only we just criticize you and reject you. It could be also a collaboration. It's really interesting.
Maybe just something small. It's not a peer review, of course, but if you have a project and the broad public is not interested or think this project is not worth funding, they won't give you the money. So it's not a review on the quality of what you're trying to do, but it's maybe a mirror of the interest for the broad public that you're.
So you know, it's like there's a famous quote that says, "Why is it not as easy to sell ideas as it is to sell shoes?" How come we buy whatever type of shoes or whatever brand of soap? And there's another famous quote from Larry, you know, I'm blanking on his name, Page, from Google, that says science is a marketing problem. Like it's not, like if, you know, somebody believes that the public won't be interested in whatever, maybe it's because we don't actually sell it well. And it's a little cynical, but it is at the end of the day a communication problem.
It has a deeper impact. Science has a deeper impact than shoes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we spend less money on science every day.
Yes, exactly. You know, like any big company, they have like, you know, like the percent of the budget that go to marketing is huge. Versus us, you know, we do science communication on the side and crumbling.
We pay taxes, right? Like schools. I mean,
Right.
or in Switzerland.
Yeah.
So I have a more specific question again about getting crowdfunding for projects at the University of Zurich. How does the University of Zurich handle this situation? Can I, as an employee of the University of Zurich, I have an idea to start an exhibition, for instance, and how can I get this funding through the crowdfunding and be an employee of the University of Zurich?
It is difficult. I actually tried, I haven't done a crowdfunding project yet, because at least partly because it's so difficult to actually deal with this kind of money in a or at least in our university. It's the thing is that, I mean, the whole university is geared to, they are very eager, of course, to get third-party funding, as all universities are, because it's a matter of financing your staff, and it's seen as a symbol also of success and everything. So third-party funding is fine and very welcome. But at the same time, it's geared towards the established system of funding. So it's usually, if it comes in from the National Science Foundation or from other foundations or from corporations, that's totally fine, and people can deal with it in an accounting kind of way. Crowdfunding is difficult, because crowdfunding is, that was the information I got when I went to the university, well, that's anonymous money, essentially.
Yeah.
What do we, I mean, we don't know where that came from, really.
Do you not get private donations for projects?
There have been, we do get private, or we, as a university, the university gets private donations, but the donors are
But
they're usually clear. And there were some kind of public debates about certain donations and stuff. So it's a little, it's a sore spot also.
Okay.
And also against that context, getting crowdfunding money into the regular, kind of your regular accounts to work with in the university is difficult. It works in other universities, but kind of the general argument is that the system of science, at least in Switzerland, in many spots, has trouble dealing with these new kinds of getting funds in.
Again, everything happens slower in Switzerland.
I mean, maybe I can comment, because I've been through this process of convincing my own institution to accept crowdfunding money, and their main concept was really these legal aspects, obviously. One was the IP. They were afraid that the donors would claim IP on whatever the science comes out, and it's clear for We Make It that the IP stays entirely with the project. Even We Make It doesn't have any claim on anything that happens after the campaign. So, and I think the question of where the money comes from can be easily solved legally by just saying, well, We Make It makes a donation to the university. In reality, that's not what happens, but I think that's an easy way to get around the problem. But it needs a conversation. I mean, I had to spend so many hours going through the legal team and the research office, sort of the people that usually do fundraising, and tell them in detail what was the exact process, what was the legal framework in which we work, so that they were confident that they could accept it.
And it needs pioneers. You are the third person I know from the University of Zurich who kind of took a few steps into the process, realized nobody's done this before, I have to be the trailblazer here, and it's difficult, and who then thought, nah.
I don't know if it would be the same in Zurich, but in the US, that's how the universities change. When internal researchers put pressure on their departments and say, I can make $8,000 doing this. Do you want to give me $8,000? No? Okay, then let me take the money. And a small number of universities have pushed back and said no, but usually the ones that do that make their own crowdfunding website, and we're okay with that too.
Yeah, so that's another thing, the universities themselves have their own crowdfunding services in the United States, so it's a little different.
So every university handles it differently, every person handles it differently. We have tonight a presentation from the University of Zurich, right? So as Mike said, you need pioneers, people trying it out. I mean, the Swiss National Science Foundation gets itself money from donations, right? And
Mike,
most of them are not anonymous. I don't know for Experiment.com, but our anonymous part is a few percent. Most of the people are not anonymous. It's just a crowd with name. We have the mails, the emails, the contacts, their addresses, right? It's not anonymous money, mostly. Some more questions?
Traditionally, in my understanding, fundable means that something is politically correct, mass attractive, and serves sort of manipulation know-how for everybody to use. I would like to hear from each of you what is fundable beyond that, because according to what I just said, if we go on with that, we create more and more self-destructive systems.
So your 3 points were politically correct, traditional.
I'd like to hear from you what is fundable beyond what I said is traditionally fundable.
Okay.
What is foundable beyond the traditional foundable?
But what the traditional fundable you were claiming is politically correct, and what were the other two criteria?
Correct, mass attractive, and towards manipulation, so anything goes.
But this is not what is, I wouldn't say that's
Attractive.
what's happening, right?
I'm not sure I agree with the premise. I mean,
Tell me what is fundable beyond that. That's the question.
yeah, but that beyond that doesn't make sense if the kind of the core of the question. I mean, I'll try to answer nonetheless. The
Forget the definition of what I think is fundable. I would like to hear from you what is fundable beyond these three criteria.
yeah, but if the three criteria don't make sense, that it doesn't make sense to discuss the
But maybe
beyond.
this raises, thanks a lot, maybe this raises a bit the issue of ethics as well, right? Because if you go beyond, how much can we go beyond? So I don't know, for our platform, for example, many people raise the issue about ethics. So we have an ethical advisory board that we never used, because it turns out that crowdfunding, each of you who tried it out knows, you start with your family, friends, it's like doing a startup. So you're not going to be unethical to your brother or to your mother, and you won't get viral without having first your mother on board. So there is kind of a self-correction mechanism, at least that we discovered. So I was wondering for experiment.com, if you go, how do you deal with this beyond ethical question?
Yeah, so we are still leaning on the institutional ethics review. So if you're a researcher at University of Zurich, you need to send us a letter saying University of Zurich approved this research concept, especially if it deals with animals or humans. If we're talking about cell lines or non-vertebrates, then it's a little bit different in the US. For a private person who wants to do a study on mice, they can pay a public review service to work with them. I don't know how much it costs. That's what they would have to do if they want to go on experiment. But we don't necessarily trust that a single individual could do a study involving humans or an invasive study involving humans or animals ethically without support, right? No science happens without a team. For an engineering study, it's a little bit different. But what's fundable is interesting because what I sometimes think is a very fundable project on experiment, it's interesting, the question is valuable to the world, the researcher has contextualized the question in the broader scope of the world. Sometimes people don't come to support that. Even when the researcher does everything right, even when the researcher is funny and interactive and present, and yet somehow other people don't agree. So what is fundable is a very difficult question, and unfortunately, I think my opinion is really different than the public in what they think.
You are the public too, remember?
It's true, the other public.
Might have a comment?
Yeah, no, going back to the general question, I think, and that's nothing I have done research on a big scale, but my experience, for example, in the Research Council of the Swiss National Science Fund, I think an argument can be made that it's specific types of projects that are funded there. And that starts with kind of the overall format. I mean, there's regulations and guidelines and thresholds in terms of time and money and personnel and everything that kind of it's still a broad corridor, but projects have to be within this broad corridor. And then there's all the literature from the sociology of science, etc., arguing that, and that could be your point of it's politically correct. They would rather say probably it's mainstreamed, and it's projects that are on vogue have better chances. Mass attractiveness is something, from my experience in the research, no. I mean, I've sat through so many projects there where I would say, well, that's, I mean, even I have to muster some energy to come up with some interest here. Mass attractiveness, I would say no, quite clearly no. And the manipulation point, I'm not sure. But I mean, the general point is, you have the traditional funding system prioritizes/prefers a certain set of projects and project sizes and everything. And projects exist beyond that. Projects exist at smaller scales, you need quicker, smaller amounts of money. Projects exist on larger scales. If you go beyond, if you want something, there's this Niklas Luhmann, famous quote, a theorist in sociology, who prefaced one of his books by saying, my university always wants to know what projects I do and what resources I need. And my project is writing the theory of society. It's going to run 30 years and it doesn't cost anything. So that's one of the large things. So there's projects beyond this kind of the core that's usually funded. And some of them are worth funding, I think. Innovative ideas that wouldn't go through the regular funding because that's too mainstreamy, and that I can imagine happens, and the sociology of science would suggest it happens. And there's also projects that probably shouldn't be funded. And the question is, how do we weed them out, not only in the regular funding system, but also via crowdfunding, if there's ethical concerns or it's just bad science and all that.
Part of me thinks that the market should correct itself. If a researcher gets money and then their results are crappy, or they don't do the study, or the public realizes, wait, this wasn't what I thought it is, ideally that person doesn't get money to do that again, right? I'm not sure if it is reality. I'm not sure if we're in a big enough market for that to happen. I don't know how communication influences it, but there's, a little bit of that, the crowd is the democracy feeling.
Dominique, you have a comment?
Yeah, and I lost my train of thought there. There's so many ideas. but there's something that comes to my mind, though, that we haven't talked at all about, is that the cultural context in the crowdfunding, takes place. Because just the way you define science, for example, is very cultural dependent. Like in the United States, it's really the same social and behavioral sciences, medicine, engineering and so on. So empirical science versus in a German way, science is also philosophy and so on, right? So that may explain why your approach to crowdfunding is very different from your approach to crowdfunding, and the project we may fund depend on that too. What do we consider quality science? It so depends of how do you define science. That's one thing. What do you say? Well, I'm a life scientist by training, then empirical social science. So for me, I'm seeing science as empirical research, answer questions that are important to the world. I go back to I'm serving in the Research Council in the United States, the National Science Foundation, and we look at the intellectual merit and the benefits for society. Those are the big things that are the criteria that the reviewers have to think about. Do I think that because of that only those projects have to be funded? I don't think so. I actually really like what you're doing. I think we need more of that in the United States to break the mold. Because if you go back to social sciences about science, sociology of science, yes, science keeps on constructing itself and reproducing the same thing, incrementally researching always the same thing, and not giving much room for people that are very creative. Proposals that are creative, that go to those big institutions, if you don't have a backup of already publications in that thing, you won't be funded in those big institutions, foundations, and so on in the United States. So if you could have some seed money to think of ideas and try to explore, I think this is great.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot. I would like to use the last few minutes maybe also to talk about this democratization. You say crowd is the democracy of science. I said before, to play a bit of devil's advocate, maybe peer review is as opposite. I'm coming to you.
Yeah.
So, and of course it's very hard you mentioned 65% of the young people get news through Facebook, right?
Right.
And so, of course, you open the door to fake news, maybe one day fake science. And as I'm talking to you, there's behind the movie with beautiful kissing scenes, distracting me. So it's what's happening on Facebook, right? So how can we really make sure that this democratization of the web at the end will not... You mentioned the risks, but concretely, how can we make sure?
But
is it in the hands of Facebook to make fake news and fake science wrong again? Or what is our role in that?
Exactly, but I do think that, when at the end those thoughts that are put there, that the quality control afterwards, I think, is important. The thing is funding is just a starting point. What happened to those projects afterwards? what have, you know, like I think if you have a responsibility in raising the funds for these people, I think it's your responsibility also to see what happens afterwards. And Luc disagree with me, but you know, there's the idea that there's somewhere.
I think I disagree too. No, but actually,
least
that's
we
a
can
discussion we
discuss.
get on the table, right?
Discuss.
Because the big issue, of course, is democratization of science means everybody's a peer reviewer. And of
Yes.
course, I think maybe we still have a bit of feeling, I mean, I don't know, very concretely, Nicole, if you're an ecologist or animal behavioralist, you get an experiment, a good hypothesis that is in quantum chemistry. How the hell do you want to quality control? So I agree with you, Dominic, maybe on the long, you can quality control the project on the long run, but you can't quality control the content. How do you deal with this? Because that's why, and that's the limit of democratization, right? There is experts, and we still have to, as science communicators, we still have to allow experts to be experts, but to communicate through us.
Right.
I'd like to take a... Yes. So, I mean, just to comment to you, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a quality control after giving away the funds, but the truth is none of the foundations that give away money to science have a leverage to do it anyway, right? So the peer review is done pre-distribution of the funding, but a posteriori, very few people do. I would argue, anyway. And then the second question is, are we ready to accept that the web has built a completely different trust system compared to the one we used to, which is, you know, based on peer review and reputation, and that we need to harness these new trust mechanisms that maybe we don't master in science, but that are perfectly working for other communities online. And I think crowdfunding is in other disciplines or in other fields already working pretty well. There's no reason why that shouldn't work for science, in my opinion.
What are these questions? Just general questions. Okay, but because I would like to hear Nicole on that. You know, still, how do you handle with this when you feel that you are not a peer reviewer but would have to be right now?
Yeah, so we asked the researcher to explain it to me like they're explaining it to the people who they'll be crowdfunding with, in that, you know, for the most part, they're not crowdfunding among other quantum chemists, right? So explain it to me like I'm an idiot, and if I can get it, and if it sounds logical, then we approve it, you know?
But it always will be. I mean, it's probably true for other crowdfunding platforms. I mean, there's very few gatekeepers, and there's a big burden on the shoulders of the gatekeeper. It's you two, and it's two at experiment.com. And I mean, what you do is not the equivalent to peer review as it would be done in the scientific journal, where you had field experts actually looking at that. It's like you said, we look for, does it apply the scientific method? It's kind of a meta review looking for, well, does it do it in a way like science is done? And that's it. And nobody could expect you also to kind of know 20 fields in detail and to actually judge the science there. And I don't see a way of overcoming this without having this kind of meta review and then trusting the crowd.
A few last minutes, a few last questions, then we close.
I have a question about the results. I mean, a lot of creativity and this interactivity goes into the application of a grant or when you start your fundraising. But then how, because I work for an institution that gives out money to the MS Society, but how do you ensure at the end of these projects that you get the same creativity back from the researchers? Because a lot of time they're just like, well, you know, we've done our project, we published in this journal, we have a citation index of this and this, but it doesn't give me anything to work with to understand what actually happened. So how can we assure, once the money is gone, that the researchers stay as creative as they were in the first place?
Yeah.
I mean, it's for Nicole, but yeah, Mike, you have an answer?
Yeah, I don't have a practical answer, so maybe Nicole can add to that. But I mean, our most famous answer would be, we need more social science research on that. It's and we really do. I mean, one of the
crowdfunding campaign.
One of the cruxes of many science communication efforts, and I'm subsuming crowdfunding in there now for a moment, is there's a lot of interesting ideas and there's a lot of things going on, but in many cases we don't know what we actually, not we, because I'm doing research on that, but what is actually achieved by that. And even the cases where we have an evaluation, it tends to be rather superficial. It's you're counting hits and clicks and participants and everything, so we'll be a huge success here in that respect. But I mean, there's more interesting outcome measures, like what do people actually take away, and what have they learned, and have they changed their behavior, or did it influence their attitudes, or whatever. There's way too little research on that, especially compared to the amount of science communication efforts that are actually going on.
And you know, it's interesting because some research has been looking at, like Mike has done, from the site perspective, from the people that are looking for the money perspective. What about the people that give the money? Something that's interesting for me is, what would people like to know afterwards, after they like the money? Would they like 1 year later to find out what happened? And that's something that we have not thought about enough. Those that give the money, what do they get in return? How can we follow up with them? And I think that's where the market, control that Nicole was talking about may come to play. More research to look at the funding people.
Maybe Nicole, yeah?
Well, some researchers on our site have been really good about posting updates. And one thing that I think is nice for them is that the way our updates are like a little blog, it gives them more creativity to talk about their results the way they want to, compared to the rigid structure of a peer-reviewed paper. More researchers do that than I expected coming in, because I thought, like you, that they would just kind of disappear. But interestingly, from the backer perspective, we had a researcher who, which we've now taken steps to prevent this from happening in the future, decided after she got the money, she didn't want anything about the study on the internet again at all. And she made everything anonymous. And she went in and she edited the page, she took down every image, she just put the word null in every field. It was really strange. And we didn't know this happened until a backer emailed us and said, what happened to this project? I want to know about the results of this project. And I said to her, I'm really sorry. I've spoken with the researcher. They're being recalcitrant, basically, and I'm terribly sorry. In the future, we don't want this to happen to backers. So backers want something, and that's a good question. What do they want, and how can we get it to them?
Maybe also from our side, in our platform, first of all, we create the contact between the public and the scientists, so you can write in to get more information. Second, the rewards. We coach their campaigns. We try to always tell them, do web seminars, contact, just inform people, give them rewards where they can learn something on the long run. Third, they get reminded automatically every 6 months or so to post updates, so it's a newsletter that you get on the long run. And fourth, and the list is endless, but it's great to conclude, we do a festival, right? Where you can talk to scientists, and we hope to do this again in 2 years, and you can ask them again about what evolved. So if tonight, for example, we're going to have the depression and psilocybin research campaign, in 2 years we can ask results. Here, you can present, right? So this is definitely a very important thing, I guess, to us. So I'm standing in between you and the lunch, so I will close here the panel. Thanks a lot to all the guests.
Thank you.
Just remind you